Welcome to BizBody, where we talk about the art and science of exercise to help you solve movement and pain problems. Okay, so we've defined exercise, like what an exercise even is. Highly encourage you have your own definition of what you think exercise is. That's what this show is all about, is making sure that this is just our take on things, an exercise perspective, non-medical perspective. We get granular with how we define things so that we are talking the same language. Today's a huge show. That it may be broken up into 2 to maybe even 6 shows, depending upon what we actually get through today. This one goes really deep.
You know, when you start talking about what we're going to talk about today, which is injuries, what it means in the sense of, you know, do you have to have pain? Do you have to have some sort of discomfort to have an injury, right? Yeah. And then when you're injured, what's actually injured? Mm-hmm. Like what part of the system, the material, is actually damaged, and does that ever come back?
Right.
I mean, those are all big questions that I think, you know, when you're talking about like, then how do you want to then load your system or exercise or do activities, like could make a big difference in how your body recovers.
Yeah, Brandon mentioned that, okay, so say I sprain an ankle, right? So if you sprain an ankle, people think of it as something happened to the ligament that you have then sprained or partially tore. If it is deformed partially, it's called a strain versus a sprain. It's not just one type of tissue that is affected, and nor is how our body works. There's also neurons and information that has to be passed through that tissue and to parts of the centers to create movement, because movement isn't done with just a ligament. It's done with everything that's perceiving the environment to then create movement, and then your body then reflects, do I like this or not? An injury in context to what I believe in a human body to even be becomes a really big deal, because it's now going to put forth the ideas of, okay, do I think the body's all made of the same stuff? Mm-hmm. Do I think the body heals at the same rates across? Do I think that if I'm injured once, that if I'm injured in the same place, that it doesn't really matter? Like if I have repeated injuries, that the same stuff was even injured if I injured the same place. Right. Like the same cells that were now alive that time are the same cells that I injured now. Greg Mack put together for his group called exerciseproed.com, which has the muscle system specialist. If you guys want to look at that, you can. This is something that I took from that course in particular. So Greg did a great job with this. He says the human body is an open, finite thermodynamic system. That energy's got to flow in and out of these live cells that are made up of concrescent, heterogeneous materials, which is basically saying concrescent meaning cells that have grown out of themselves, right? Like saying, okay, like when you're first an egg and a sperm, they fuse, and then all of a sudden they start replicating, right? So you have skin cells that start to mature this way, and neurons that mature that way, and then you have teeth material that form that way, and eye material and brain materials. They're all grown out of each other, but they're all made to specialize to form these different cells. So technically, they're grown out of the same thing, but they form different things.
That also work together.
That have to work together, yeah.
Have to communicate together so that your teeth cells don't create your toenail.
Yeah, that's called cancer.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, then they're put together with an intrinsic control system that's somehow excited to life by a spiritual force, right? So somehow you're alive, and it's basically off of these controlled negative feedback loops, and it has to be able to govern its own abilities to maintain homeostasis and allow tasks to be completed in the environment in this biomotor system. So there's a lot to unpack with that, but really what it comes down to is you got a bunch of stuff that's grown out of one thing that has to present itself as being a self, right? Because then there's some problems with immune function and whatnot, and other diseases if you don't recognize yourself as yourself, right? That's where stuff like rheumatism and whatnot, you don't recognize those cells as your own. You start attacking your own cells, right? And then lastly, you have to be able to take in stimulus from your environment to create solutions. Otherwise, you won't even know where to go, because your brain, let's face it, it's this gelatinous mass in your head that's in the dark. So the only reason it gets information is because your eyes give it information, your ears give it information, your hands and your feet give it information. You can smell, you can taste. So any one of these can eventually affect how you move and how you feel. It's a lot. It's a lot.
The simple idea that you can get hurt, you can have something taken out of your body potentially, and then that doesn't change the system in any way is crazy. Like to even think that that's a real thing, right? Yeah. But the normal person, it's like if I injure my ankle, the example we gave, and I rest it for a couple weeks, it goes right back to being as good as new. Like gets swollen, you can't move it, it's hard to walk on, but eventually like that gets better, right? Like you give it enough time, you do some therapy on it, whatever, right? To get it to feel better faster, that once that pain and discomfort goes away, and you may not even feel a limitation anymore in it, and you think that it's okay, right? Like everybody does. Like I thought it was okay. Like, oh, like, my ankle's fine. But how many times do you sprain your ankle, and then the next time it's easier to sprain it, and then the next time it's easier, right? Like, so why is that the case? Like if it's better, if it's perfect, right? Like if it went back to what it was before.
Or your balance is off on that side, which is partially local, but it's also systemic. Like balance in itself is how your body's interpreting these feedback loops to somehow get your center of mass over your base of support and orchestrate muscular tension to do so in real time and space. So it's like there's got to be a temporal spatial awareness of what's going on, time and space, to be able to orchestrate or at least solve these movement problems. And if we can't solve those movement problems, usually there's some sort of tightness or soreness or pain associated with it as a protective mechanism, of which we then view the pain and tightness as the problem, rather than your whole system's current solution to what's going on, which could be amazing breadcrumbs and trails of evidence of what may be helping and hurting, rather than let's just get this pain away.
Just in general, people believe that, we know more than the body knows. Like the body is like messing with us, right?
Humbled.
Like, right.
And whenever I think that, I get humbled so fast.
Right. It's like, hey man, like you sprain your ankle, like why is this ankle blown up 3 times the size? Like what's wrong with the body? It's like, no, like
it's part of the process.
The body's just like figuring out a solution to the current problem, which the current problem is you did damage to the tissue and the joint, and now all it's trying to do is splint it, like so that you don't injure it more.
You don't have to think about it.
Yeah,
it just happens.
It just happens naturally, which like when you think about it in that terms, it's unbelievable that it does that.
Yeah.
But then when you think of it as the individual that it happened to, you're like, this sucks. How do I change this? How do I get rid of this?
How do I get rid of this?
As fast as humanly possible, right?
Yeah.
And like that happens with everything. We're just using a sprained ankle as an example. Right.
Well, you also bring up a really good point. It's the idea that usually, because our conscious mind has so little control over our non-conscious self, there's so many things happen where we're on autopilot and our body just does what it does. And we're like, oh, that's great. Like, this is working, right? Because I can do the things I want to be able to do. As soon as I can't do the things I want to do, all of a sudden it's not working.
Right.
But like, oh, if I sprain my ankle and there's an immune inflammation response, so that the process of like internal bleeding, and then all of a sudden you got this proliferation of tissues, and you're starting to recover these tissues, so that all of a sudden you can now you can use that later, right? Because that takes a certain amount of time with different amounts of tissue. It's like, but that's not okay because it's not on my time frame.
Right.
For
Well, I have a
body's
game
doing-
on Friday.
Yeah, I got to use this now.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like, yeah, that's a bummer. However, as soon as the body isn't doing what we want it to do, we sometimes deem it as incorrect. Like, oh, this should not be tight. This should not be painful, right? Well, how do we know? Like a majority of it's going on without us ever knowing anyway. Like you can't tell me with all of, I don't know if any of you have ever studied what makes up a cell, but your cells are like a whole city by themselves, like one cell, and we're made of like trillions of them. We have no idea what's going on with any cell of our body.
No.
So it's like, and nor would we want to.
Right. I mean, that would just be like mind numbing to think about.
Yeah.
Right. And I think when you have to think, like, that's also not a good thing. Right.
Right.
Like, I don't even want to think about that. Like, I just want it to do what I want it to do when I want it to do it.
Just want it to work, right? Yeah. And that's why it's like, okay, when we talk about health, like health just isn't the absence of disease. We're saying health is your ability to do the things that you want to be able to do in some capacity and be able to recover from it. And if you can't do those things because your ability to recover from it, or even be able to do it to begin with, isn't there, there's a whole bunch of different qualities that we're going to be talking about throughout this that all lend into being able to function. The word functional has really gotten abused here. That's why I like to say the version of health is about a body that does the things that you want to be able to do, right? Which means that you got to know what you want to be able to do. And instead of just saying, I should be able to do whatever. I mean, think about how many athletes that want to be the best at everything, but they have to be very specific at their training to get better at specific attributes, because physiology always comes at a cost. One thing gets better, another thing kind of gets pruned because we're an open thermodynamic system. It takes too much energy. You're trying to conserve energy and you're trying to move better. So you only get a certain amount of time and energy for things to get better.
And I think like the reason why we're like, this is potentially becoming mind numbing is, why do we have to be so specific on what exercise is? Why do we have to really define some of these things? Is because if we're going to get into this idea of exercise and this idea of health, right, we need to be on the same page and trying to get, the audience out there to really understand like how we define these things, so that when we get to the things that are less mind numbing, like you have a better idea of where we're coming from and how we interpret these things, so that when we give advice, you can have a better sense of, oh, okay, that's, like that's applicable in this context, right? And I think that's where things get lost too, is just the context of things.
Yeah, context is king.
Yeah.
Or queen, whatever you want to say.
Yeah, because again, it comes down to is like, I can, we can sit here and talk about all these cool exercises for this and that and the other, but it's all contextualized, right? Like, it's not all good for certain things, not all bad for others. And, at the end of the day, it's like, context matters. And I think there's a lot of things out there where, things get bashed, things get, celebrated without knowing the true context of how those things were put together. Right. And so hopefully, over the course of the next few weeks, as we're going through these different things, we can get through this stuff so that you guys can start to understand like where we're coming from as two practitioners who probably overanalyze everything. But
because we got put in our place.
Yeah, with that being said, it's because we've been humbled over and over again by people that are way smarter than us, that we're trying to we want to take things that are that can be very, very complex and start to make them easier to digest.
Thank you for listening to the BizBody podcast. If you want to support the show, go ahead and click subscribe and leave us a review. Share this with anyone that you know it would help. Also, if you want to visit our brick and mortar, go to body-activation.com and you can work with us in person, one-on-one. And you can go to exerciseproed.com and learn about the muscle system specialist.